That night Bob Dylan walked onto the stage, his eyes locked onto the silent face in the front row, and he began playing the melody he hadn't sung in 40 years. The venue was small. Not a stadium. Not an arena. Just a theater in Minneapolis with maybe 400 seats, half of them empty. Dylan didn't play small venues often anymore, not at 73, not after 5 decades of being called the voice of a generation, the poet laureate, the prophet who never asked for the title. But tonight was different. A benefit show. Local cause. Somebody had asked, and for reasons Dylan didn't explain to anyone, because he never explained anything, he'd said yes. The stage was simple. 1 microphone. 1 stool. 1 guitar. 1 spotlight that created more shadow than light. Dylan walked out without fanfare, without introduction, carrying his battered acoustic guitar and wearing the harmonica holder around his neck like he'd done since 1961. The audience applauded. Respectful. Quiet. These weren't screaming fans. They were people who understood that watching Bob Dylan perform was less about entertainment and more about witnessing something you couldn't quite name. Dylan sat on the stool, adjusted the microphone, said nothing. He never greeted audiences anymore. Never said good evening or thank you for coming. He just started playing. He began with, "Girl from the North Country." Slow. Deliberate. His voice cracked and weathered like old wood, each word carved from decades of living. The audience listened in silence so complete you could hear the guitar strings vibrate in the pauses between verses. 3 songs in, Dylan stopped. Not a normal pause between songs. A full stop. Guitar silent. Harmonica untouched. He just sat there on the stool, his hands resting on the guitar, his eyes scanning the front row. The audience waited. 400 people holding their breath. Dylan's gaze settled on a man in the 3rd seat, front row left. An elderly man, maybe 70 himself, wearing a worn jacket, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his face carrying the kind of lines that come from hard work and harder years. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The man in the front row wasn't moving. Wasn't reacting. Just looking back at Dylan with an expression that might have been recognition or might have been nothing at all. Dylan stood up slowly. Left the stool. Walked to the very edge of the stage, guitar hanging from his shoulder, and stared down at the man. "You were there," Dylan said. Not into the microphone. Quietly. But in that silent theater, everyone heard it. The man nodded once. Barely perceptible. Dylan stood there for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then he walked back to the stool, sat down, and began playing a song he hadn't performed since 1963. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 61 years earlier. Bob Dylan wasn't always Bob Dylan. In 1963, he was Robert Zimmerman, a 22-year-old kid from Minnesota who'd changed his name and moved to New York City with a guitar and a head full of Woody Guthrie songs and an anger he couldn't quite articulate about everything wrong with the world. He was starting to get noticed. Folk clubs in Greenwich Village. Small gigs. People were calling him talented. Authentic. The real thing. But he was also broke. Living in a tiny apartment that barely had heat. Eating 1 meal a day if he was lucky. The romanticism of being a struggling artist wore thin when you were actually struggling. One winter night, February, freezing, snow piling up in the streets, Dylan was walking back to his apartment after a gig at Gerd's Folk City. He'd made $12. Enough for groceries if he was careful. He passed an alley off McDougal Street and heard something. Not music exactly. More like humming. Off-key. Broken. Dylan almost kept walking. New York alleys at midnight weren't places you investigated. But something made him stop. In the alley, sitting against a brick wall with snow gathering around him, was a man. Maybe 40. Maybe 60. Hard to tell. His face was weathered beyond age. He wore a coat too thin for February and boots with holes in them. And he was humming, trying to hum, a melody Dylan recognized. Blowin' in the Wind. Dylan's song. The song that was just starting to get played on college radio stations. The song that would eventually make him famous. But this man was humming it all wrong. Off-key. Missing verses. Like he'd heard it once and was trying to remember how it went. Dylan stood at the mouth of the alley, guitar case in hand, watching this homeless man attempt to sing his song. The man looked up. Saw Dylan. "You know this one?" he asked, his voice rough with cold and something that might have been alcohol or might have been just decades of hard living. "Yeah," Dylan said. "I know it. Can't remember all the words. But it's a good one. Heard it on the radio in a bar. Kept thinking about it all day." Dylan could have walked away. Should have walked away. He was cold. Hungry. Tired. But instead, he walked into the alley and sat down on the frozen ground next to this stranger. "I'll play it for you," Dylan said. The whole thing. He opened his guitar case, pulled out his acoustic, and in that frozen alley at midnight Bob Dylan played "Blowin' in the Wind" for an audience of one. The man listened, tears freezing on his face. When Dylan finished, the man said something Dylan would remember for the rest of his life. "That's the first time in 5 years anybody treated me like I was worth stopping for." Dylan didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to respond to that kind of naked honesty. So he did what he always did when words failed. He played another song. Then another. For an hour, he sat in that alley and played while the man listened. Eventually, Dylan had to leave. Had to get out of the cold. "You gonna be okay?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Been doing this a long time. I'll manage." "What's your name?" "Thomas Hendricks. But people used to call me Tommy." Dylan pulled out the $12 he'd made that night. All of it. Handed it to Tommy. "Get somewhere warm." Tommy took the money with shaking hands. "Why'd you stop?" "People don't stop." "I don't know," Dylan said honestly. "I just did." He never saw Tommy Hendricks again. The next week, Dylan got signed to Columbia Records. His career took off. "Blowin' in the Wind" became an anthem. Bob Dylan became a name. Then an icon. Then a burden he would carry for the next 6 decades. But he never forgot that night in the alley. Never forgot the man who said nobody had stopped for him in 5 years. Never forgot that he'd almost kept walking too. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. In 1978, Dylan wrote a song. Never recorded it. Never performed it. Just wrote it late one night in a hotel room, thinking about all the people he'd walked past in his life. All the faces he'd ignored. All the times he'd been too busy being Bob Dylan to remember he was also just a person who could stop. He called it Alley Song. Nobody knew it existed. It lived in a notebook he kept but never shared. Until tonight. Minneapolis. 2024. 61 years after that frozen alley. Dylan sat on the stool and began playing a melody nobody in the audience recognized. His fingers moved across the guitar strings with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd carried these notes for decades. How many times do we walk on by? How many faces we don't see? How many voices asking why? How many chances to be free? The elderly man in the front row. Thomas Hendricks, 70 years older but still carrying the same weathered face, closed his eyes. Tears ran down the lines of his cheeks. Dylan's voice, cracked and ancient, filled the small theater. Not performing. Not entertaining. Just bearing witness to a promise he'd made to himself in 1963, to remember that every person who hears your music used to be worth stopping for. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. After the song ended, Dylan set his guitar down. Stepped off the stage. Walked directly to Thomas Hendricks in the front row. The audience didn't know what was happening. The theater manager backstage looked at the security guard, uncertain whether to intervene. Nobody moved. Dylan stood in front of Thomas. "You remembered," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. Took me 50 years to get clean. Another 10 to find steady work. But I remembered that night. Kid with a guitar who sat in the snow. I'm sorry I didn't do more. You did enough. You stopped. Dylan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a harmonica. Old. Worn. The same one he'd used in the 1960s when he was just starting out. This was with me that night, Dylan said. In the alley. I want you to have it. Thomas took the harmonica with shaking hands. Held it like it might break. I can't. You can. You're the only person who should. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan didn't return to the stage. Didn't finish the concert. He simply nodded to Thomas, turned, and walked out of the theater through the side exit. The audience sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, they began to applaud. Not the wild applause of entertainment. The quiet, reverent applause of people who just witnessed something they didn't fully understand but knew mattered. Thomas Hendricks sat in his seat, holding the harmonica, crying openly. The theater manager found him after everyone had left. Sir, are you okay? Can I call someone? I'm fine, Thomas said. I just needed to hear that song. 3 months later, Bob Dylan's representatives announced he was donating the proceeds from that Minneapolis show, along with a matching amount from his personal funds, to establish the Thomas Hendricks Foundation, providing musical instruments and lessons to homeless shelters across the country. Dylan never explained why. Never gave interviews about it. Never mentioned Thomas's name publicly. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The harmonica Thomas received that night sits in a small display case at the Foundation's headquarters. Next to it, a handwritten note from Dylan. For Tommy, who taught me that stopping matters more than arriving. Bob. Thomas Hendricks died in 2026 at 74. He'd spent his final years volunteering at the Foundation, teaching harmonica to people living in shelters, telling them over and over. Somebody stopped for me once. Changed everything. Bob Dylan never attended the funeral. But a guitar case appeared at the service, Dylan's signature on the inside lid. Inside the case, sheet music for Ali's song, with a note. This one's yours now. Play it for people who need to hear it. The song has never been commercially recorded. Never released. But it's played every week at homeless shelters funded by the Foundation. Played by people who learned it from Thomas. Played by people who understand that sometimes a melody isn't about fame or recognition. Sometimes it's just about remembering that you stopped when you could have walked away. And that made all the difference. Years later, a young journalist asked Dylan in a rare interview why he never performed Ali's song after that night in Minneapolis. Dylan looked out the window of his tour bus for a long time before answering. Some songs aren't meant to be sung more than once, he said. That one belonged to a specific moment. To a specific person. Playing it again would be like trying to recreate something that can't be recreated. Tommy heard it. That was enough. But don't you think the world deserves to hear it? Dylan turned back to the journalist with that look, the one that had silenced interviewers for 60 years. The world doesn't deserve anything. People do. Individual people. And I sang it for the person who needed to hear it. The Harmonica Foundation still operates today. Hundreds of people have learned to play because of an instrument program that started with one old harmonica and one man who remembered being seen when the world had stopped looking at him. In 2027, a documentary filmmaker tried to make a film about that night in Minneapolis. Dylan refused all involvement. Thomas had already passed. The theater had been demolished. All that remained were the memories of 400 people who'd witnessed something they still couldn't quite explain. One audience member, a woman who'd been sitting in the 5th row, described it this way. It wasn't about the music. It was about watching someone carry a promise for 61 years and finally set it down. Dylan played that song like he was delivering a letter that had taken a lifetime to arrive. And when he gave Thomas that harmonica, it felt like watching someone close a book they'd been reading their whole life. Final page. Final word. Done. Bob Dylan is 83 now. Still touring. Still writing. Still refusing to explain himself. But people who know the story say that every time he plays Blowin' in the Wind, the song that started it all, the song that made him famous, the song Tommy Hendricks was humming in that alley, there's a pause before the final verse. Just a breath. Just a moment of silence. A space where Dylan remembers that once, on a frozen February night, he almost kept walking. But he stopped.